They had exactly 48 hours to pack their entire lives into cardboard boxes before the county sheriffs arrived. Desperate and nearly bankrupt, they bought a dilapidated cabin deep in the New Hampshire wilderness for almost nothing. But beneath the decaying floorboards, they were about to uncover a chilling million-dollar secret. The notice was taped to their door on a rainy Tuesday evening. It wasn't a polite request or a warning. It was a brutal, legally binding declaration of eviction. David and Sarah Miller had lived in their modest rent-controlled apartment in South Boston for 7 years. It was their sanctuary. David, a 32-year-old freelance graphic designer, and Sarah, a 30-year-old substitute teacher, had built a meaningful life within those brick walls. But that life was dismantled the moment Gregory Finch, a ruthless property manager for Apex Holdings LLC, decided their building was more valuable empty than occupied. Apex Holdings had purchased the entire block through a shell corporation. Within weeks, Finch exploited a notoriously shady legal loophole known as the Substantial Renovation Clause. By claiming the building needed urgent structural overhauls requiring complete vacancy, they legally bypassed rent control and forced everyone onto the street. This scenario plays out across cities everywhere. Long-term tenants find themselves legally outmaneuvered by multi-million-dollar real estate conglomerates, facing sudden homelessness despite years of on-time payments. David tried to fight. He organized with other tenants, hiring a local housing attorney named Thomas Kessler. For 3 agonizing months, they battled Apex Holdings in court, but Finch had an army of corporate litigators. They dragged out proceedings, bleeding tenants dry with legal fees. Eventually, the judge ruled in favor of the developers. The Millers were given 48 hours to vacate. "Where are we supposed to go, David?" Sarah had asked, sitting on the edge of their mattress, surrounded by half-taped moving boxes. Her voice was hollow, stripped of the vibrant energy that usually defined her. The Boston rental market was unforgiving. Rents had skyrocketed, and requiring first, last, and a security deposit meant they needed nearly $10,000 just to get keys to a comparable apartment. Between legal fees and the sudden loss of David's biggest freelance client, their savings had dwindled to exactly $22,450. It was too much for assistance, but nowhere near enough to survive in the city. In sheer panic, Sarah began scouring foreclosure listings. They needed something permanent, something no landlord could ever take from them. Late one night, her eyes locked onto a grainy photo on a county tax auction website. The property details: Coos County, New Hampshire, deep in the Great North Woods. Lot size: 4.5 acres of dense timberland. Structure: a 1,200-square-foot A-frame cabin built in 1974. Price: $18,000. Cash only, as is condition. It was a staggering 4 hours from everything they knew, nestled in a region notorious for harsh winters and total isolation. The previous owner, Theodore Carmichael, had apparently passed away without a will, leaving behind a mountain of unpaid property taxes. "It's 18 grand, David. We can buy it outright," Sarah whispered, pointing at the screen. "We'd own it. No mortgage, no Gregory Finch. No one can ever kick us out again." David stared at the dilapidated cabin on the screen. The roof sagged, windows were boarded up, and nature was reclaiming the porch. It was a fixer-upper nightmare, but looking at his wife's desperate, hopeful face, he knew they had no other choice. They wired the money to the county clerk the next morning. The drive up Interstate 93 was a silent, anxious journey. As they crossed into northern New Hampshire, cell service dropped and towering pines closed in around the 2-lane highway like dark sentinels. They stopped for gas and a meal at a local diner in a town with a population under 800. When David casually mentioned to the waitress, a stern-faced woman named Betty, that they had bought the old Carmichael property, the diner grew uncomfortably quiet. "You folks bought Ted's place?" Betty asked, pausing mid-pour. She exchanged a quick, unreadable glance with a man in a flannel shirt at the counter. "Well, Good luck to you." Old Ted wasn't just a recluse. He was a paranoid survivalist who never let anyone within 100 yards of that cabin. Kept to himself, muttered about government confiscation. Just watch your step out there in those woods. The warning hung heavy in the air. Arriving at the property, reality hit them like a physical blow. The driveway was washed out, forcing them to hike the last quarter-mile carrying suitcases. The cabin smelled of damp earth, mildew, and decades of neglect. Animal droppings littered the hardwood floors, and wallpaper peeled away in sickly yellow strips. Their first night was spent huddled on an air mattress in the living room, surrounded by absolute darkness. The forest's silence was deafening, broken only by the eerie settling of the old house. Morning light exposed the full scale of the rot, but anger and betrayal are powerful motivators. Fueled by the sting of their eviction, David and Sarah channeled frustration into raw physical labor. For the first 3 weeks, they existed in a haze of dust and sweat. They tore out moldy drywall, scrubbed hardwood floors with bleach, and patched roof holes. Without a mortgage, their remaining $4,000 stretched surprisingly far at the local hardware store. It was during the 4th week, while measuring for new baseboards, that David noticed the discrepancy. He was an architectural designer by trade. His brain was wired for spatial awareness. He had sketched a rough floor plan for material costs. The house was a simple rectangle, but the math wasn't adding up. Exterior length, 40 feet. Interior length, 31 feet. Accounting for wall thickness, approximately 1 foot total. Missing space, 8 feet. "Sarah," David called out, lowering his laser tape measure. "Come look at this." He walked her through the measurements. At the center of the house, dividing the living room from the bedroom, was a massive floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace. A chimney would take up space, but not 8 feet of solid depth. "Maybe it's just a dead space," Sarah suggested. "Like an old storage closet that got walled off?" David walked to the fireplace, pressed his ear against the river rocks, and knocked. It sounded solid, but curiosity had taken root. He remembered Betty's words. Paranoid survivalist, muttered about government confiscation. "I need to look at the basement," David said with sudden urgency. The basement was a cramped, unfinished cellar with a dirt floor and low ceiling. They had mostly avoided it due to the strong smell of sulfur and damp clay. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, David navigated down the creaking stairs, Sarah close behind. He pointed the beam toward the center, directly beneath the living room fireplace. There, rising from the dirt floor to the wooden joists above, was a solid wall of gray cinder blocks. It was crude work. The mortar was smeared and uneven, entirely different from the poured concrete foundation of the rest of the house. "He built this later," David whispered, tracing his hand over the rough blocks. Ted Carmichael walled off the entire center foundation. David didn't hesitate. He jogged upstairs and returned with a 10-pound sledgehammer. "David, wait. Are you sure? What if it's structural?" Sarah cautioned. "It's not bearing weight. The floor joists run right past it," he replied. He took a wide stance, swung the hammer back, and drove it hard into the center of the cinder block wall. Crack. Dust plumed into the stagnant basement air. He swung again. The third strike shattered the center block, sending chunks tumbling into a dark void beyond. A rush of cold, stale air blew out, carrying a sharp metallic scent. David grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the jagged opening. The beam cut through darkness, reflecting off something dull and silver. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. David didn't answer. He kept swinging. Adrenaline surged as he smashed away the cinder blocks, tearing down the false wall until a large enough opening was cleared. They stepped over the rubble into the hidden space. It was a perfectly square room, about 8 by 8 feet, sitting directly beneath the massive stone chimney. But it wasn't the room that made Sarah gasp. Built seamlessly into the far wall, securely anchored into a reinforced steel frame, was a massive circular steel door, a vintage Mosler bank vault door. It stood 6 feet tall, adorned with steel locking bolts, a combination dial, and a large, spoked turnwheel. It was the kind of door found in high-security banks from the 1930s, weighing easily over a ton. The sheer impossibility of it, sitting in a cheap, rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere, left them completely paralyzed. "How did he even get this down here?" Sarah whispered, running trembling fingers over the cold steel dial. "He didn't," David realized. "He didn't bring the vault into the basement. He built the cabin around the vault. This was here first." David gripped the heavy steel wheel and pulled. It didn't budge. The vault was locked tight. For the next 3 days, they became completely obsessed. Renovations halted entirely. David spent hours online, sitting in his truck at the end of the driveway for cell service, researching vintage Mosler vaults. He learned that cracking it without damaging contents required either an expert safecracker or brute force destruction of the locking mechanism. They opted for the latter. David returned from the hardware store with an industrial angle grinder, diamond-tipped cutting wheels, a pry bar, and tungsten drill bits. The process was deafening and terrifying. Sparks showered the cramped hidden room as David ground into the steel casing. The noise echoed through the floorboards like a screeching mechanical wail. They worked in shifts, wearing safety goggles and ear protection, choking on burning steel. On the evening of the 3rd day, after snapping 3 drill bits and burning through 8 cutting wheels, David finally breached the inner tumbler housing. With a steel punch and sledgehammer, he drove the locking pin out of alignment. A loud, hollow clang resonated from deep within the door. David dropped the hammer. He looked at Sarah, who was gripping the cinderblock wall, her face pale with anticipation. He stepped up to the vault, grabbed the spoked wheel, and pulled. With a deep metallic groan that sounded like a tomb opening, the massive steel door slowly swung outward. Stale air rushed over them. David raised his flashlight and stepped into the darkness. This was no ordinary safety deposit box. The vault interior was lined with heavy steel shelving. On the left sat a complex vintage shortwave ham radio setup, flanked by sealed military-grade ammunition crates. But it was the center table that made David's blood run cold. Resting on a heavy wooden desk were dozens of thick, leather-bound ledgers. Next to them sat faded, yellowing blueprints. Sarah cautiously stepped past David, picking up the top blueprint. She unrolled it under the flashlight. It was a highly detailed schematic, but not for a house or commercial building. "David!" Sarah choked out, her eyes wide with terror and awe. She read the stamp on the bottom right corner. It was the complete architectural floor plan for the United States Federal Reserve Bank in Boston. Directly beside it, stacked in neat banded bricks wrapped in plastic, was over $2 million in sequentially marked, uncirculated $100 bills. They hadn't just bought a house, they had bought a staging ground. The silence inside the subterranean vault was suffocating. David's flashlight beam trembled, washing over the tightly wrapped bricks. The sheer volume of currency was an abstract concept made terrifyingly physical. Sarah reached out with a shaking hand, touching the plastic wrapping of the nearest stack. "David," she whispered, "the bands. Look at the paper bands." Stamped across the faded paper wrapping each brick of cash was a crisp, undeniable seal. Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Series 1982. "This isn't drug money," David muttered. "This is uncirculated currency. It never hit the streets. Ted Carmichael didn't just rob a bank, he intercepted a federal transfer." But the money, while visually staggering, was completely toxic. Spending sequentially marked bills from a decades-old federal theft was a guaranteed one-way ticket to federal prison. The cash was a museum exhibit, beautiful but useless to them. The true treasure lay on the heavy wooden desk. David set the flashlight on a shelf and pulled the first leather-bound ledger toward him. The book was heavy, its spine cracked with age. He opened it to the first page. It wasn't a diary. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, written in cramped, meticulous cursive. For the next 10 hours, completely ignoring hunger and exhaustion, David and Sarah sat on the cold steel floor, cross-referencing the ledgers with the blueprints. What they uncovered was a ghost story written in ink and blood. Theodore Carmichael was not a reclusive lumberjack. According to the internal documents and coded organizational charts, Carmichael had been a ghost payroll architect and master money launderer operating in the shadows of 1970s and 80s Boston. And he didn't work for just anyone. He worked for Gennaro Angiulo, the ruthless underboss of the Patriarca crime family, notorious for laundering millions through complex real estate shell companies before his FBI arrest in 1983. Carmichael was Angiulo's bagman for commercial real estate. When the feds closed in, Carmichael panicked. He skimmed $2 million in a daring transit heist to fund his disappearance, stole the Federal Reserve blueprints as leverage, and vanished into the woods. The ledgers detailed every property Carmichael secretly purchased to wash Angiulo's blood money. He built a labyrinth of corporate shell entities to hide ownership of dozens of Boston apartment buildings. Sarah pulled a newer-looking ledger from the bottom of the stack. Unlike the others, it had entries dating to just 3 years ago. Carmichael, in his paranoid isolation, had obsessively tracked the modern descendants of his shell companies. The entries showed asset transfers from original shells to current holdings, Apex Holdings, LLC. Sarah stopped breathing. Her eyes darted from the page to David, mirroring the exact moment of terrifying realization. Beside one entry was a physical address jotted in the margins. It was their old South Boston apartment building. The cosmic irony hit like a freight train. Gregory Finch wasn't just a greedy corporate suit. Apex Holdings, LLC, was the modern evolution of a mafia shell company. Finch was systematically liquidating the old Patriarca real estate portfolio, aggressively clearing out long-term tenants to flip buildings for billions in clean capital. Carmichael's death had left a massive loose end. When he died of a heart attack owing back taxes, the county seized the property, unaware it was owned by Boston's most prolific money launderer. Apex Holdings didn't even know this cabin existed because Carmichael had bought it under a completely disconnected alias. "They don't know," David whispered, a dangerous thrill replacing his fear. "Finch and his backers don't know where the original ledgers are. They think the paper trail connecting their shiny new empire to the 1980s mafia burned decades ago." Sarah looked at the $2 million in useless marked bills and down at the rotting leather book in her hands. "This book," she said, her voice turning ice cold, "is the silver bullet. It proves Apex Holdings is built on a foundation of federal crimes. They weren't just victims anymore. They were holding the detonator to a billion-dollar corporate empire." Fear is primal, but revenge, when meticulously planned, is a profound art. David and Sarah didn't call local police. The sheriff in a town of 800 was unequipped for a federal banking conspiracy. More importantly, handing evidence over blindly meant losing all leverage. Instead, they packed the ledgers, blueprints, and one bundle of marked bills into a waterproof duffel bag. They left the rest sealed inside the Mosler vault and drove back to civilization. They needed a very specific kind of monster to fight the monsters at Apex Holdings. They needed Thomas Kessler. Kessler, their former housing attorney, was a cynical, chain-smoking bulldog who despised corporate developers. When David and Sarah dropped the ledger and the 1982 cash onto his desk, Kessler almost swallowed his cigar. "Tell me you didn't rob a bank," he rasped. "We didn't, but we found the man who did," David replied. He spent an hour walking Kessler through the nightmare. Kessler listened in absolute silence. When David finished, the lawyer leaned back, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "You understand what you have here? You can't spend that cash, but under the SEC whistleblower framework, The government pays private citizens up to 30% of all recovered assets. Apex Holdings has a portfolio worth roughly $400 million. If we hand this to the DOJ and they seize Apex's assets, you two stand to make tens of millions, legally, cleanly. We don't just want the money, Sarah said. We want Gregory Finch to look us in the eye when he loses everything. Kessler went to work, brokering a meeting with the FBI and the Department of Justice. Federal agents were initially skeptical, but the moment Kessler produced the missing 1982 Federal Reserve blueprints and Carmichael's verified handwriting, the room shifted from skepticism to lethal focus. A federal sting was authorized. David and Sarah demanded one condition. Kessler set the trap using their eviction as bait. He contacted Finch under the guise of a settlement dispute, vaguely implying the Millers had found historical documents that complicated Apex's ownership. A mediation meeting was scheduled in Apex Holdings' downtown headquarters. On a crisp Thursday morning, David, Sarah, and Kessler sat across a massive mahogany table from Gregory Finch. Finch looked exactly as David remembered, impeccably dressed, arrogant, smirking. "I don't understand what this is," Finch sighed. "The eviction was perfectly legal. If you're looking for a nuisance payout, you're wasting my time." "We aren't here for a payout," Kessler said smoothly. He slid a single photocopy of a ledger page across the table. Finch glanced at it. For a fraction of a second, his eyes locked onto the name Gennaro Angiulo, connected by a line to Apex Holdings LLC. The color drained from his face so fast, it was as if someone had pulled a plug. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by hollow panic. "Where did you get this?" Finch whispered, his voice stripped of all corporate polish. "Theodore Carmichael says hello from the grave," David said. "He kept the receipts, Gregory, every single one. We know your entire portfolio is a laundering operation." Finch's hands began to shake. He had thrown them out onto the street and forced them right into the lap of his company's darkest secret. "Listen to me," Finch stammered. "The people backing this company will kill you. Give me the original books and I'll cut you a check for $5 million right now. I'll give you the deed to the South Boston building, whatever you want." "We already have what we want," Sarah said softly, standing up. As if on cue, the heavy glass doors swung open. 6 federal agents in tactical windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back stepped into the room. Gregory Finch collapsed back into his leather chair as an agent read him his rights and slapped handcuffs over his expensive silk cuffs. The corporate guillotine had finally fallen, but this time Finch was the one on the block. The fallout was historic. The DOJ raided Apex Holdings, freezing over $400 million in illicit assets. The $2 million in stolen Federal Reserve cash was recovered and returned to the government, closing a 30-year-old cold case. Because David and Sarah provided foundational evidence, the SEC whistleblower program awarded them 18% of recovered liquid assets. 9 months later, David and Sarah Miller stood on the porch of their New Hampshire cabin. The rotting wood was gone. In its place stood a stunning custom timber frame home with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking untouched wilderness. They never moved back to the city. The South Boston apartment building was transitioned into affordable housing under a new city grant. They had been pushed to the absolute edge by a system designed to crush them. But beneath the dirt and rot, they had found the one thing the corporate machine could never anticipate: the perfect, devastating truth. If you love stories about ultimate underdog revenge and hidden history, hit that like button right now. Have you ever found anything crazy hidden in an old house? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Spine and Stories and ring the bell so you never miss another incredible real-life mystery. Share this video with a friend who loves a good plot twist, and we'll see you in the next one.